Happening happened, buried in the well where sink the stories we tell. And so let's throw, as fortune casts its lot of concern, a coin and join our voices in wishing the stories return.
Thank you for gracing us with your words once again. Welcome back to Solacene, everyone. This is the 8th week in our storytelling series, so we're about halfway through, a little bit over halfway through, which is pretty fun. I'm excited for the conversation today. What are we going to be talking about, Aaron?
So lately, like with each episode, I've been trying to find a common theme between the questions. Usually we have 3 questions. And this week I'm thinking it's character.
Okay.
Especially because maybe a little bit of an extraneous mention, but we've been apartment hunting recently.
It's true.
And the word that always comes to mind, I find, when people talk about apartments is, I just want something with
character.
A little bit of character.
That's true.
And I don't think it's coincidence that people use that word, so I think we'll get into that later. But also we're talking about villains, and that's a very archetypical, usually the primary or second most important character in terms of developing a story and plot. And also we are talking about clothes and the way that they basically develop persona or character for all of us. So I was pretty proud of myself for coming up with that one.
Yeah, that's quite impressive, to be honest, because my thought was these are 3 completely discrete topics for today. But yeah, we're talking about clothes, places, and obviously the villain, because we like talking about villains, despite this being a very optimistic podcast.
Right. And speaking of optimistic podcast, I'm going to be optimistic and hope that everyone listening is subscribed to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or SoundCloud or whatever they use. We also have Instagram and TikTok. And also in the description, you'll find our emails. We'd love it if you could contact us there. I personally really enjoy receiving any kind of comments, especially or even like hate-filled ones. So if you have any really like searing criticisms for me, just let me know, because I basically eat those for breakfast. Yeah,
but make sure you address them to Aaron, because even the slightest criticism makes me very upset. Because today someone commented on Instagram. It was literally a compliment, but I just took it really badly. Like, I'm glad that you guys are outside your comfort zone. And I was like, are you serious?
Yeah. So you can send us compliments. You can also do it in the little comments box on Apple Podcasts. Those are very helpful in terms of like boosting the algorithm. So too, if you want to drop a rating. And we also have Field Notes, which is a weekly email, as Alicia calls it, a love letter to life, to the world, or something like that, that you can sign up for in the description. And I think that's all I want to say about that, because I don't like plugging stuff.
No.
So we're going to start by talking about villains. The question was, what makes a good villain? And it was inspired by the notorious tiny mastermind of Bikini Bottom, Plankton. So that's where I started for this question, of course.
Okay.
In terms of what makes this a good villain, I was thinking, well, even in a show like SpongeBob, wherein morality is very rarely discussed, if ever, like the plots are usually just silliness, we have a villain, and he's kind of the implicit, here's what's good, here's what's bad. Because Plankton obviously is always trying to steal the Krabby Patty formula. He's trying to get ahead without having worked for it, and
trying to be deceitful.
He lies a lot. He does a lot of bad things to try and achieve this goal, typically working solo with like a genuine contempt for friendship or people. I find he has his computer wife, who I would say he doesn't really treat the nicest.
It's true.
So in Plankton, I think what the show does is show us, or show the children, all the ways that you shouldn't be. It's like, you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't cheat, you shouldn't be so contemptful or contemptuous of others, because it makes you like this guy. And he's shown to be very pitiful and pathetic, basically, is the word. Like, and everyone else doesn't like him because he kind of ruins everyone's time. He's always angry. He doesn't seem like a happy person, in contrast to all the other characters. Maybe Squidward is the outlier there. But did you have any other notes on Plankton?
I did have a note on Plankton, and it was that I find a character like Plankton, or my other example was Newman from Seinfeld.
Yeah, it's a good
is that
analog.
They're good villains in comedies, but if you put villains like Newman or Plankton into a serious film, which I feel like a lot of modern films attempt to do, it doesn't work.
Okay.
Because if you have the kind of jovial dictator who's like, oh, but people like go to him for advice, like, because SpongeBob goes to Plankton and like everyone goes to Newman and Seinfeld. It's like, it doesn't work in a serious setting. I find it works really well in a comedic setting. And that was my first thought on this question, was the villains have to be well suited to the audience and to the world.
Yeah, and to the genre. It's interesting you bring that up, because I think another part of it, especially with Plankton and especially with Newman, is that there's an element of the audience actually prefers these guys, or really...
You like to see them on the screen.
Yeah, really likes watching them. Whereas in a drama, maybe you don't want your villain to be so
bumbling,
kind of hilariously devious.
Yeah, exactly. And another example I had for a well-suited character to the audience and to the story was Prince Hans from Frozen, because he was one of the first villains that came to mind because he was just so evil. And, like, kids got it, but it wasn't like he was kicking puppies and being cruel and, like, stuff like that the whole time.
Yeah.
Like, because he was, for 80% of the movie, the good guy. You were rooting for him and Anna. You were like, oh, they're in love. This is so great. But then when he betrays her and literally tries to kill her, it's like the kids understand, like, oh, he was being deceitful the whole time, without, like, laying it out and saying, oh, by the way, all of these things he was doing before were lying and he was manipulating her. Like, but kids get the lesson of, oh, acting like this to get what you want is bad. And I just thought he was another really good example of a good villain. But someone I thought was a bad example would be, I don't really love the Avengers villains very much.
Okay.
But this is very personal preference.
For sure.
Because I was reading lists of good things about villains, and it was like, you have to be sympathetic to them and understand that they think they're the good guy. But I don't like when the villains think they're the good guy. I like when they know they're being evil, and that's definitely a preference. But do you know what I mean? Yeah,
there's a simplicity to certain stories that are really lovely, and I do think there's been this overwhelming switch towards more three-dimensional villains, and this has come also with the protagonists who have become less purely virtuous. They're all anti-heroes now. They all have skeletons in the closet. Also, I think that's something we can talk about next week, which is what makes a good hero, because that's the other side of it, obviously.
That's a good question.
And I do think there's definitely a place for just the evil forces. I mean, I think it's quite telling that we've been mostly alluding to children's stories so far, because those tend to have simpler lines and maybe be more impactful for that. But I think someone like Sauron in Lord of the Rings is a good example of just evil, right? Like, there's no well, actually, when you think about it, Sauron was right. And there's nothing like that. And I think it really works because it enhances the drama and the contrast and, you know, the virtue of the heroes because of what they're up against. My favorite quote from Lord of the Rings is, I think it's like the king who says it. This is outing me as such a bad fan or whatever, but there's the quote when the place is just being overrun by orcs and Sauron's army, and they're like, what can one man do against such wretched evil or whatever? You know what I'm talking about? And they're talking about just the overwhelming power that it seems, you know, pure badness contains. But because of this, we get to see the power that comes with uniting all the good forces, and that's always more inspiring than just a hero overcoming his own personal demons to finally do the right thing or whatever.
Yeah. I like all of Tarantino's villains too. They're all very black and white for the most part. It's like they're just evil. And I like when the villains almost are inevitable, for lack of a better word. But in Lord of the Rings, it's a good example. It was the evil was always inevitable. We always knew it was foretold, basically, that this was going to happen, and then there'd be the fall of the elves and all of that jazz.
I think there's a place for both stories. Do you think that the villain always should lose?
Yeah.
Always? Every time?
Not every time.
Okay.
Let me think.
Because I was thinking about this, as I have quite a lot, because pretty much in kids' stories, villain always loses. It's quite simple. And on the few occasions in adult stories when it's oh, the villain actually wins this time, you're always like, come on. Because it feels like they're being deliberately subversive, but there's really no point to it. And I think it's obviously much more satisfying when the heroes win, but with losses along the way. A good example, I think, is WALL-E, where it's WALL-E is this little robot and he's rebelling against the big spaceship hell,
civilization.
Yeah. And Wall-E eventually triumphs and they bring the humans back, but Wall-E kind of dies along the way.
Yeah.
And I always think that would be much more impactful if Wall-E just stayed dead along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Because then it's like, oh, they got it, but it didn't come without great cost.
Yeah, I don't mind when that happens. When the villain doesn't win, but the hero also doesn't really win. Yeah. My final example for a good villain, I feel like it kind of goes along with this, is Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty.
Yeah. I'm
talking about the TV show because that's what I'm most familiar with, but obviously there's a whole canon. But in the show, it's like Sherlock, it's like he's a good guy. He's always working for good, but it's like almost always self-serving just out of his desire to solve mysteries. And Moriarty is, like, he's just evil, but he has his reasons for being evil. And I just really like that because there's so many times in the show where you're like, oh, like he's actually gonna lose. And like sometimes it would leave a whole season with you thinking Sherlock's dead or Moriarty has won and this whole plot is unrolling and there's nothing we can do about it. We have to just watch it. But then he comes back from the dead or he figures it out. And I really like the way that show does good and evil because it's always black and white. Like you always know who you're rooting for. You never like, hey, maybe that guy has a point.
Yeah.
But it's in a way that it is nuanced and interesting. It makes you reflect on the real world in a positive way.
Also a good example of two characters who are perfect foils for each other.
Exactly.
I was also thinking that what makes a good villain is one who appeals or fascinates and really strikes at the anxieties of the time. Like it's a timeliness. I'm always so kind of interested in the rise of the Joker in the last, like, I don't know, like 2 decades or so.
Yeah.
Like, it's wild. And I think that's really interesting. And I think the Chris Nolan, Heath Ledger iteration kind of addresses this directly, where it's like, it's explicit in the text that the Joker is representing chaos in a world that's increasingly ever more systematized and routine-based and automatic, basically.
Yeah.
So I think the kind of fascination with him, where we get a new one every like 3 or 4 years, and there's a fanfare more so even than there is for Batman, is because it's directly touching something that we're all quite cognizant of.
I have a lot to say about the Joker.
Okay.
But I think that's a really excellent example of you have to be careful of making your villains too sympathetic or too relevant because people, as we have seen, have Joker posters and are like, oh, I'm going to model my personality after him. I'm going to be contrarian. And I'm like, okay, these could have been the good guys could have been working towards breaking out of the simulation. Like it could be more Matrix-like than, oh, this is the bad guy breaking out of the simulation. And then the good guys are actually trying to like maintain order. You know what I mean? Like I don't want people going around being like, oh no, my role model is the Joker. And they're like, no, it's like ironic, but it's still, you know, he's like anti-system and he's really sporadic and I like him. Like I don't think that's a good thing. I think you need to be careful that you don't make your villains too sympathetic or else you have people walking around with villain tattoos.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really a sad world where there's a not insignificant amount of people who would idolize the Joker. It's kind of telling of the world rather than maybe the writing itself. But yeah, I guess there is some responsibility. There's a Joker sequel being made. Did you hear about that? Lady Gaga's going to be in it.
Really?
Yeah.
I liked the Joker movie. It was a good movie.
Yeah, it was okay.
But we'll see.
What else was I going to say about this? Oh yeah, the villain helps us learn and grow just as much as the protagonist does. Because take the Thanos in the Avengers, right? Like it's him and it's like 1,100 superheroes that he's coming up against, but he's posing this specific threat to people. Like I can imagine being a kid after that Avengers movie where they all died and being like, whoa, that was really impactful because these are the heroes that I grew up with. And so like when they all eventually overcame that big boss of Thanos, the kid's like, yes. And they feel like they, you know, like in stories when the hero triumphs or when the hero goes on their journey or journeys, you feel like you're going along with them.
Yeah, it's true. You can grow through the films. and learn through the villains in like a positive and negative way, because sometimes the villains are cool and it's like they have a good skill and they're just misapplying it. If I have that skill, I need to make sure I apply it in the right way.
Yeah, exactly.
You need to be more like the heroes. It's kind of the point of the foils and so on.
They show you where you might stray off the path and what could happen to you as an individual and also to society when that happens, like Plankton with the chum bucket. That's why I always find like the apocalyptic stories wherein the villain has won or has won briefly, like in the SpongeBob movie, to be really interesting, because it's like it doesn't just show you what this corrupt worldview or methods does to the person enacting them, but what they eventually do to everything around them. Like in The Lion King happens as well, right?
Yeah, that's a good trope when you get a little glimpse of the badness.
I had another thing that I think we can talk about next week, which is fan fiction, like the history of fan fiction, because as I've mentioned on the podcast, I've been reading Ovid's Metamorphoses recently and surprised and amused by how it reiterates upon the events of the Trojan War as told by Homer. And fan fiction, I think we look down on, maybe unfairly. So I think next week we can like unpack that fully. Okay.
Thank you for that question. So speaking of unpack, the organism of the week is...
cotton.
Cotton, right. Nice. My drawing was, in fact, sufficient. So everyone knows what cotton looks like. But you can describe it anyway.
So there are these cloud-like fluff balls on a brown plant. And that's that.
Yeah. So cotton is in the genus Gossypium and the family Mallow. So it just sounds soft and fluffy. And they were once believed to grow sheep as their fruit. And it was a bit divisive. Some thought the sheep were like fully sheep but fully plant, so they stayed attached to the plant. But others believed sheep would break off and then just become sheep.
Straight out of Ovid.
Yeah. And at that time, that myth was called the vegetable lamb of Tartare. And cotton blows my mind, because it's like, why is this a plant that we just have on our body all day, every day in some form? Everyone's wearing a little bit of cotton, I'm sure.
KOTN.
Yes.
Just joking. Sponsor us, please.
Please. That'd be like one of the only brands that I'd be like, yes. That derailed me, because I have a cotton bag and it has like cotton in Arabic on one side. And so people always stop me and they're like, do you know what your bag says? And I'm like, pretty sure it says cotton. And they're like, you're right. And then I have to explain the brand and the partnership with the farmers and everything. Good marketing on their part.
Yeah.
Anyway, cotton is cellulose, a natural polymer. So that's why it doesn't break down the way that if you were wearing like a lettuce shirt. Because that's what I was confused about when you think about, like, why is this a plant that we can just wear? Because that's not really a thing. Like, you don't wear food.
Well, there's those like citrus leather that they make now.
Exactly. But those are like cured. But basically cotton is just such a hardy fiber that it doesn't break down as quickly. And I didn't know that cotton seeds are used to make cottonseed oil. Like, I didn't know that cottonseed oil was a thing. So it's like all parts of the plant are pretty much used. The stalks are used for animal feed because they can break it down because of enzymes in their stomach and what have you. And then anything else is just tilled back into the soil because it's good for the crop when it grows again. However, it is an insanely water-intensive crop. It uses 8,000 to upwards of 25,000 liters of water to make 1 kilogram of cotton. So make sure you're aware of that next time you buy a pair of heavy jeans. And it's a shrub. Doesn't really look like a shrub, but it is. And it's native to tropical and subtropical regions. And something else I didn't know is that the cotton fibers grow in something called a ball, B-O-L-L, which is like a protective case. Kind of cool. And it's the world's oldest natural fiber used for making clothes.
Really?
Yeah. So, cotton, sponsor us. Come on the show.
Please. I can just imagine us uploading an hour-long podcast wherein we interview a cotton shrub.
Yeah. What's it like To always be thirsty.
And then and then we like augment our voice so it sounds like we're responding also. Or I do it like a puppet.
Yeah.
Like a ventriloquist.
Then we send it to the brand and they're like, what
is this? So we say we're applying to be the new marketing leads.
Mm-hmm.
So I assume you picked cotton because we are talking today about the story that clothes tell as well.
Mm-hmm. That was my choice.
So I'll let you begin on this one.
Yeah, so the story of clothes. Where to start? I tried to keep it simple because we're going to have a whole clothing semester. But I broke it into 3 categories. The literal story of clothes, the story of the materials and like how they came to be, and then outfit and wardrobe curation. So the first one is the literal story of like how we got them and memories made while wearing them. And I think that is something that we all do. Like some people, they just shop for very basic necessity. I'm not really talking about them because it's a little bit different for them.
Well, I had a list actually because with regards to like the story that clothes tell, I thought that story is different for everybody. Mm-hmm. So like the most common today is just ornamental, let's call it, where it's not really, doesn't really matter what you wear every day in terms of your conditions or what you're doing.
Yep.
Because most people are just typing. It doesn't really matter what you wear for that. But it could also be practical. So that's like the person who, I got to wear this wetsuit because I'm surfing. Yeah. Or on a construction yard. It could also be traditional or ceremonial, in which case also the wearer doesn't have too much say in what it is. I guess like the only way that's really survived in our modern Western context is like black tie events. Or
wedding dresses.
Or wedding dresses or things like this. Quite rare though. Yeah. It could be political. Okay. As in not just, you don't just care how it looks or how it makes you look, but what it literally says on it. Or it could be like a form of, I don't want to say pride because that makes it seem like a bad thing, but if you actually made the clothes yourself, then it's like, it's something different from just wearing clothes because they look nice, right? Then it's like you're displaying your own skill.
It's like artwork.
Yeah, it's artwork.
Yeah.
So I think there's like a time and a place for each, but I do think it's kind of sad how pretty much all our clothes on almost everyone now is just ornamental or just nice looking. That's all it is. It's just like, what does it look like? Nice. And there isn't a lot of weight put into that. Yeah.
And I feel like because that's the case, a lot of our clothes are just ornamental. It leads us to shop cheaply. It leads us to shopping on websites that are
3 pairs of jeans for 11 cents.
Yeah.
Or when I was at the Gap that one time, we still talk about it, where they were selling, or was it Old Navy? I think it was the Gap.
I don't know.
They were selling shorts for 29 cents.
Yeah.
And people were just walking out with cartloads full.
Yeah. But I'm trying not to derail myself. Basically, when you buy something from Shein or Cider or whatever the shop may be, you know, those of you listening know, I've seen them in thrift stores and they're just the flimsiest. It'd be like when you make costumes for kids' plays, it's like that. Like the seams aren't finished. You could just tear it by looking at it the wrong way. And it's like, but it doesn't matter because it doesn't need to actually keep you warm. It doesn't need to actually withstand any kind of vigorous activity. It just needs to sit on you while you're writing at your desk or typing in class. And it's like, that's fine. It serves the purpose, but it leads to a whole world of problems, which is I'm not going to mention today. But I was thinking about in the Solacene, how will clothes and stories go together? And basically I was thinking we will know the literal history of our clothes, who made them, who designed them, where the materials were harvested. We'll know a lot more about how materials are made. That's something that I have researched quite a bit, but I realize not the average person doesn't understand how cotton goes from the plant to a sheet of fabric. Yeah. And at first I was like, oh, you just like, when you think about it, you're like, oh, maybe you just like roll it out and it becomes a fabric. But there's so many steps in between. And I feel like people in the Solacene will know about that, have some hands-on experience, perhaps even weaving and processing fibers.
Well, among other things, that will make them more appreciative of each garment.
Yeah.
And one thing I find funny is that even in the most distant dynamic that we have right now between ourselves, the wearer, and the production of the clothes, still front and center on the tag, it will say made in wherever, made in Indonesia, made in China.
It's true.
And so it's still like this acknowledgement that this is kind of important. But that's the extent of what you know. I think there's 1 or 2 brands that will tell you like the name of the sheep that the wool was taken from or whatever. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
I think that's kind of cool, but more along those lines is what you're saying. Because it'll be more local amongst other things.
Yeah, it will definitely be more local, a lot more handmade.
So it tells the story of the time and the place, basically.
Yeah. And yeah, that's the history of the materials and the process and everything. And I think our wardrobes will be a lot more curated in that way. You'll probably have made some of your clothes, or at least someone in your family will have made them for you. It'll be a bit more, as you said, local. And therefore, you'll care for them better. You will be more likely to mend them and just appreciate them. I don't think in the Solacene we're going to all have like utilitarian Soviet style like wardrobes of like 3 white shirts and a jumpsuit. But I do think it'll be a little bit more intentional. Like you'll know, okay, I'm going to go out and I need a new shirt, or I'd like a new shirt. It doesn't need to all be based on need. But it's going to cost a lot of money or a lot of time to make it. So you'll have to be smart about your choices. Whereas now it's like, I want a new shirt. I can buy 5 for my budget of $20. Mm-hmm. And you do it, and then they end up in landfills and they don't end up being cared for.
I've actually had quite a change in mind over this kind of thing, because I used to be, if you recall, I'm sure you'll recall, because you were always grumpy about how often I'd reiterate it, like firmly against clothes that weren't just, as you said, utilitarian and just for comfort. Mm-hmm. So basically how everyone is now during pandemic and post-pandemic with regards to like sweatpants to the office. Who cares? Mm-hmm. That's how I used to be, but like militant about it.
Yes.
To the point that when people were wearing, as I call them, crispy clothes, like formal wear, I would just get so angry.
It would ruin your day.
It would ruin my day.
To see other people wearing them.
Well, it's because I felt secondhand pressure to do so. Mm-hmm. But now I think that I really like the idea of ceremonial wear that we're not entirely in control of. It's just like, I have to wear this thing. I have to wear this brooch. Is that what they're called?
Yeah.
Not really brooches, but like, I have to wear this thing that's handed down my family, or because it's this occasion, I have to wear this thing. Like, I like the idea of ritual in clothing a little bit more than that, because it feels like then we are dressing ourselves up as a character in a story that isn't just about us. Mm-hmm. We're part of a wider story then, which I really like the idea of.
I also think the constraints, as we talked about extensively last week, inspire creativity. Like there's always in TV shows, the school, they all wear uniforms, and there's the kid who wears her brooch and the kid who wears her skirt like
Fresh Prince wearing the jacket inside out.
Yeah, exactly. It's like they're still wearing the uniform, but they're forced to be creative. And I think, if there was a bit more structure to clothing, it would inspire almost more creativity, because right now there's no limits to what you can wear. You can wear as much as you want, as little as you want, what have you. And it's like, I feel like people almost all end up just falling exactly into the same mold of like hipster. Hipster is probably not the word these days, but you know what I mean.
Individualist.
Yeah, so everyone's dressing as an individualist, therefore everyone looks
very
exactly
similar,
the same.
For sure.
So in the Solacene, it'll be probably be more structure, because there would be the constraints of your clothes have to be
like school uniforms. We've talked about that before. Yeah. That's a good example. It's like you're in this setting. Mm-hmm. We like the idea of school uniforms, so people are wearing that. And I also think that trends and aesthetics have been codified to such a ridiculous extent that it really takes the earnestness and I would say the joy out of dressing, out of clothes for most people.
Yeah.
So I think it's like, even if you want to get rid of everything and just have 3 white t-shirts and 3 pairs of pants and just like not have to think about it, be like a cartoon character and just have your outfit in the closet, that is still telling a story about yourself, because it's like, oh, he's the kind of person who doesn't like thinking about clothes. He's the kind of person who wants to define himself in other ways.
Yeah.
Which is fine, but I guess I'm just trying to get the point across that there is no way to not dress in a way that is defining yourself as a character. Even when you deliberately try not to, that's revealing about your character.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, clothes are just the most political, most social thing in our day-to-day lives, because I've talked about this, I don't know if it was on Solacene, but basically throughout history, whenever there's been a cultural or social revolution, it's almost always been associated with a huge shift in style, because people who are part of a movement say we're all going to dress the same and it's going to be a statement. It doesn't need to be like wearing mini skirts, but it could be we're all wearing, like, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I think it changes the way people dress and the way people express themselves, and then it leaks into just pop culture, basically.
It reflects the story of the culture, like the story of the times. And I think right now, what I see is that it reflecting the idea that people are
trying to find an identity.
Trying to find their identityless and meaningless. Like, we're not meaningless, but we are searching for meaning through clothing often.
Yeah, I think so.
And in trends, I mean, I don't want to get into that because those are like, every half a day there's a new trend. But like trends tell stories in themselves as well. For
sure. And I'm also very convinced that these sustainability and like climate revolution will be very closely linked to a revolution in fashion. And we almost can see it in this early stage as like everyone thrifts now. Yeah. And everyone has a consignment shop, it seems, on Instagram or on Poshmark or whatever. And it's like, I think that is in the right direction, but it's getting almost halted. And it's stopped because it's so accessible. It's not letting us move to the next step of local production in the first place. It's like this weird dichotomy where everyone thrift shops, but if they ever buy clothes new, they're shopping on one of those really cheap websites, fast fashion websites. So we need to bridge the link between thrift stores and fast fashion and like make it slow fashion, and then you can resell it on the thrift market if you want.
Okay. Moving on to the final question of the day.
Yeah.
Which is, how has story been removed from places / architecture? So I started this one, I was doing some research in trying to really define like, what is an architectural narrative? What does that even mean? Because we can say, like, having not really read anything about architecture in our lives anyway, at least on my case, that, oh yeah, buildings have stories. But it's like, do we mean stories as in different levels? Told you I'd use that pun.
You got it.
But it's easy to say that without really understanding what it means. It's like, well, this one is brutalist, so it's telling this certain story about the people who live in it. But it's like, it's deeper than that, and it's also a little bit more evasive a term than that. Like, it's hard to define. So I had this quote, which was, architecture constantly tells stories, but often these narratives are one-dimensional, flat representations. These stories comprise a single layer, style. A layer that tells nothing of culture, history, or pride in a place, but is instead rooted in economics and the desire to build things cheaply and quickly. So obviously that's a critical quote about contemporary architecture, I guess, which I thought was relevant to our question, which was about how story has been plucked out of these things. And the first thought that I had that I relate to you this week is that space itself is kind of like a sacred concept. Well, I think so anyway. Like, again, this is like when we talked about secular faith, but it's like, this is a secular idea of sacred. And I think this is something that we all kind of recognize intangibly because of our kind of frustration about the digital migration. Even if we're not very conscious about feeling frustrated about this, like, oh, I have to work from home. I think deep down we're feeling, I'm tired of sitting at home because space is important to me. Real space, not like cyberspace, which is fake. Do you have any thoughts about this?
You were saying to me the other day, I don't think you said it on the podcast, so I'll share it. But you were saying when you walk into a store and it's really open and airy and there's not too many people in there, but it's also not like wall-to-wall products, you feel like relief. And you're like, this is nice.
Yeah, you do.
And I feel like everyone feels that, but we don't play to it very often in our design and in our choices for space because we're like, no, it's boring or whatever.
Well, I'm not just talking about, like, minimalism is definitely like a way of understanding this. It doesn't have to be minimalist, but like a good example, I think, is quite often there'll be like a really big room and people will just set about filling it. But I think that in the filling of it, it takes away the niceness of it just being a really big room, kind of like that. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, our apartment, we've kept it very spacious.
Yeah.
But it's been criticized for being so, it's like, do you even live there? Like, it doesn't look like anyone lives there, but it's very, I guess, Scandinavian in the minimalism.
It's like nice. It's like in Step Brothers when they say we're going to stack the beds so we have more room for activities.
That's us.
But we actually just like moving around.
Yeah. You were saying from the quote is funny because I thought something very similar in the way that we create spaces these days and how story has been removed from it, is that we're afraid to like actually make a dent in anything. So everything is just two-dimensional like ornaments.
Yeah.
So it's like a dentist office could very easily be converted to a cafe, which could then be converted to an apartment because it's just a white square.
Yeah.
Everything we build now is just a blank canvas, which I think in part, like, it's almost a sustainable idea of like just create a bunch of these canvases and anything can go into it. But I think we need to be a little bit less afraid of like actually making a mark, like actually painting the ceiling, actually carving into the columns.
I agree. I think a cool analog that just came to my mind between the architecture and the clothing we were talking about is when people have that saying, which is that you should wear the clothes shouldn't wear you.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that on people, not to be critical, but sometimes I feel it myself. Like if you're wearing a new thing or an expensive thing, that thing is wearing you. It's a garment, but it's like you're afraid to crease it is a good example, like with shoes. And I think that when clothes are lived in, that makes it so much cooler. Like if you look at inspiration albums for fashion, usually it's just the clothes or whatever, but the person is actually doing something. Like they're candid or they're like shoveling and it makes it look cool, or they're farming. Or I told you a while ago that people on bicycles look so interesting and it's because they're going somewhere.
Yeah.
So there's an intent to it. And I think with buildings, again, like also shaping the building, which is what you're saying, doing so with intent and not being afraid to make it look like something, not to try and actually impart some characters we were talking about, but also the way that we traverse these spaces. If we're taking the storytelling subject literally, then it's like the building is the setting. We are the characters in the setting, and we have a responsibility to the space to behave in a certain way, I think.
Yeah, and my favorite part about like we're apartment hunting, but also just looking at real estate in general is, oh, this is really cool. This apartment used to be a post office.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you were to live in there, it would just have a completely different literal feeling than if you were living in an apartment like we do, which is very modern and just built to be an apartment. And I don't think we need to always be converting old spaces into new things. I always think it'd be nice if we just built the post office in the old post office, or built the bank in the old bank instead of converting the old bank into a cafe and then building new banks.
Or the old train station into a Joe Fresh store.
Yeah, exactly. And for some reason anyway, I just think we need to, just use the spaces as they were intended, or not be afraid to make new ones that are very ornate, because it's not like they're going to go to waste. If someday you need to close down, someone else will appreciate it.
Yeah, I was thinking about that because we talked about obviously old buildings and the story in them and how we're maybe recontextualizing that. But also new buildings, like, for instance, our current apartment building is about a year old. And it looks exactly like, when I say that, everyone listening will know what it looks like.
Yeah.
Because it is very neutral colors, polygonal shapes, and it kind of has this feeling of being machine-made. I don't want to say soulless, but soulless. And it's like, what story is that telling about us?
Yeah.
Or about its inhabitants? It's like there's no place to it. There's no past, because you can be sure that none of the materials are local.
Yeah.
And because place-wise, it took no care into its surroundings. Like it wasn't like, it would really complement this building if we made it look like this. There was no thought about that.
Yeah, and the architect wasn't a local who had a passion for building houses. There's like, I wish I had written down the name. In England, those really posh apartment buildings. Do you know what those streets are called? Or in London. They're like downtown, and they're like the most posh apartments or flats you can get.
Don't know.
And they were originally built by this female philanthropist as affordable housing. And she's like, I just want to make these beautiful houses so that people who have trouble affording housing, like, they deserve to live somewhere nice just like everyone else. And they did. They got to live in these nice houses, and that was a trend. But then obviously, oh, these are really cheap. We can buy them and up the price. And now they're the most expensive place to live in England.
Yeah.
And now if you're building affordable housing, it's going to be just the most, just like cardboard boxes basically with running water, hopefully. And we just need to, I feel like we all need to be a little bit more like her. I feel like people deserve to live in somewhere with a story. Like, I don't mind living in a new building. I think it's excellent to live in a new building if it's done sustainably. But it's like, perhaps
there can be something to it, some character.
Yes, some character.
I'm just going to read what I wrote down here because I don't think I can word it better, which is that because authenticity is so rare, every remaining piece is commodified and put under glass as a tourist exhibit. Historic tourist places are often thus depressing because they remind us of when the world was realer.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked a lot about this last week, our recent visit to a famous church. And we also felt it a little bit when we were in Quebec City recently, earlier this year. This feeling that it's such a beautiful place with a nice architecture, but it's sad how crowded it is because everyone flocks here, because their own towns are just lacking character.
Mm-hmm.
Or I guess it doesn't have to be made a tourist place, but they are, as you said, with the places in London, it's like they're priced out of normal people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You once said, and I wrote down your quote because you're that prolific, that we've been priced out of authenticity.
Yeah.
And one final thought that I had as we're preparing to move into a new apartment, which is it's very simple, but it has a little bit more character than here. And I'm really looking forward to decorating it because it has a lot to work with. And I was thinking, even when I was a kid, I remember my friend's mom, she used to paint all their furniture, paint floral decorations on them. And even where I work, there's some really cool hand-painted furniture, which just the people who own it painted it.
Yeah.
But now we don't have even the most basic construction skills or artistic skills to be able to decorate our space or have the confidence to, so we rely on Etsy prints and IKEA decorations to try and bring some kind of life into our spaces. But I feel like it just could never work. You could almost buy everything pre-made, but it would never look like your space because you didn't have a hand in it. And I really think we can try in our daily lives, just take the risk of painting your table or take the risk of sewing something to put up in the windows or frame. And I really think that'd be beneficial to bringing your own story into a space.
We can provide the character.
Yeah.
Nicely said.
Thank you.
So thank you all for listening. Hope you liked that episode. If you did, give us a thingy.
Yeah. Or tell your friends about it.
Yeah.
It would be really excellent.
Okay.
So thank you.